Hello, I'm Dr. Afua Cooper, expert historian of Black Canadian history and the principal investigator for a Black People's History of Canada. This project addresses gaps in Canadian history education by producing research that examines the over 400-year history of Black people in Canada. For these 4 centuries, Black people have contributed vastly to and shaped Canadian history, society, culture, and heritage from coast to coast to coast. Black people in their capacities as enslaved persons, Maroons, loyalists, refugees, sailors, soldiers, freedom seekers, scholars, nurses, fur traders, immigrants, educators, porters, musicians, composers, politicians, students, artists, writers, scientists, and explorers have built this country. Yet these achievements and contributions have been diminished, marginalized, and at times erased. We often begin Black Canadian history with Matthew Da Costa. He comes to us as the first documented Black person in Canada. That is, we have historical documents that record his presence. Da Costa signed a contract with the French to work for the French governor of Acadia, Sir Pierre de Gouat-Dumont, in the capacity as translator and interpreter between the French and the Mi'kmaq nation. We know he signed this contract in 1608, that beginning in 1609, and for the next 3 years, he would serve as an interpreter for de Gouat-Dumont, who was governor of Acadia, in voyages to Canada, Acadia, and elsewhere. It is important to emphasize that Da Costa was a free man who had linguistic, interpersonal, and cultural skills that the French found useful. For example, we know that he spoke French, he spoke Dutch, he spoke Portuguese, he also spoke the Mi'kmaq language, and he probably spoke other languages that we don't know of. He made his own contract with the French and seemed to have had some independence in how he conducted his life. It is also likely that he traveled with Samuel de Champlain, that famous French explorer who came to Canada and, as we know, established a habitation at Quebec City. Sadly, the next record we have of another Black person in Canada in the early years is that of an enslaved child who came to be called Olivier Lejeune. Olivier arrived in what is now Quebec City in 1629 and was taken there by the English invader, David Kirke. David Kirke sold Olivier Lejeune, this young boy from Africa, about 9 years old, to this Quebec clerk. The child was baptized and given the name Olivier Lejeune. By the time the 17th century ended, most of the Black people coming into Canada were enslaved persons who worked in the homes, businesses, and on the farms of the white colonists. So slavery came to be this originary experience of Black Canadians during the 17th and 18th century. And what I mean by originary, it's as a cohort of people, as a collective of people, Black people. Most Black people in the 17th and 18th century, at least up to maybe around 1783. So most Black people in Canada at this time, the land space we call Canada, were enslaved people. And so slavery forms a significant chapter in the history of Black Canadians. Slavery was legal and was supported by colonial legislation. This means laws passed by the respective provinces, local legislation, and also by metropolitan legislation. Metropolitan means the mother country, and in this case, France and Britain. So France and Britain passed laws in their respective legislatures overseas pertaining to slavery, and then these laws were promulgated in the colonies. So in the case of the French, the Code Noir. The Code Noir was written up in Paris by the king, Louis XIV. Well, he didn't write it. He had his secretaries and scribes to write it. And then the edict or the laws that emitted from that were issued in the colonies as part of the legal structure of that place. I will now highlight two other important moments and personalities in the history of slavery in Canada. So we talked about Olivier Lejeune, this young child, 8 or 9 years old, who arrived in the colony and was enslaved. And further on, in 1734, we have Marie-Joseph Angélique, and I'm mentioning her because of just the spectacular nature of how she was introduced, or this event of how she was introduced into Canadian history. Marie-Joseph Angélique was a Portuguese-born Black woman who was enslaved in Canada by the Francheville family of Montreal. In 1734, in April, a fire ripped through the city, and in the aftermath, close to 50 buildings, including homes and businesses, were destroyed. Angélique was accused of setting fire to the city and was arrested. It did not help that before the fire, she had tried running away from slavery. She had escaped. However, the constables brought her back shortly after the fire started. So she was arrested, thrown in prison, taken to the courts, where she was found guilty. On June 21st of the same year, 1734, Angélique was tortured and hanged in the square of what is now Old Montreal. And I should add that after the hanging, her body was cut down and it was burnt, and then the ashes were scattered to the four corners of the earth. Another incident that's important in the study of the history of slavery in Canada is that of Chloe Cooley from the Niagara region. In March 1793, Chloe Cooley, an enslaved woman, was tied up, manhandled, thrown in a boat by her owner, and the boat was rowed across the Niagara River. On the other side of the Niagara River, of course, is the state of New York. So Vrooman rowed her across the river with the help of his henchmen into New York State, and there he sold her. The record states that Chloe Cooley screamed violently and made resistance when her enslaver brutally manhandled her. She did not go easy. She fought back. Cooley's resistance eventually led to the first anti-slavery bill in the Canadian colonies, and this bill was passed in July 1793. So in March, she was manhandled, rowed across the river, sold into New York State. In July, the Upper Canadian province, Upper Canada is now called Ontario, passed a bill that banned the importation of new slaves into Canada. The governor at the time, John Graves Simcoe, wanted actually to abolish slavery, but there were so many legislators in his cabinet and in the assembly itself who were slaveholders that they resisted this idea that slavery should be abolished. In fact, they actively resisted it. So Simcoe did what for him perhaps was the next best thing, that is to ban the importation of new slaves into Canada. But, and it was because of the Chloe Cooley incident, because that incident was reported to Simcoe, and as a result, he wanted to abolish slavery within the colony over which he was governor. But that didn't happen. Chloe Cooley goes off into the mist of New York. We don't know her fate. Maybe further research will uncover what happened to her. Along with the Olivier Lejeune story, these are other stories of enslavement in Canada, where thousands and thousands of Black people were enslaved by white slaveholders. At this point, I must mention another group of African people who were forcibly taken into Canada, especially the Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. And these were slaves of the New England planters. Now, the New England planters were invited into the maritime colonies by a governor like Governor Lawrence. It was under during Lawrence's regime that thousands of Acadians were expelled from the Maritimes, and Lawrence wanted now subjects loyal to the British Crown to come and take up the lands that the Acadians had left when they were expelled. So these planters, as they were called, planters basically means colonists or colonizers, people who would come in and farm, came from New York and New England, and they brought about 600 enslaved human property with them, Black people. So between 1655 to 1775, you have this influx of New England planters who brought their enslaved property with them, around 600 enslaved people, as far as we can tell. In the 18th century, the arrival of another large group of Black people, this time the Black Loyalists, also was a phenomenon and contributed greatly to Black Canadian history. So the Black Loyalists were formerly enslaved persons who supported the British during the American Revolutionary War. And when the war concluded in 1783, the British transported close to 3,500 of these Black Loyalists to the Maritime provinces, namely New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. And about 700 also made it to the provinces of Upper and Lower Canada. Upper and Lower Canada are Ontario and Quebec. These free Black people built communities in the provinces in which they lived and gave of their skills and talents. Sadly, slavery braided its way throughout this period as white loyalists brought thousands of their enslaved human property with them. We know at least 2,000 to 2,500 of the Black people who came in during this period were enslaved people. So you have this paradox, you have this phenomenon during this loyalist era of free Black people, those who had supported the British in various capacities during the war as soldiers, spies, cooks, laundresses, and so on. And you know, they got their certificate of freedom, they were transported up to Canada. So they were free. They established various free communities, Birchtown in Nova Scotia being one of them. On the other hand, you had a situation where the white loyalists brought enslaved Black property with them. So in places like what are now Ontario and Nova Scotia, you had slave Black people living alongside with free Black people in the same communities. As the century progressed, that is the 18th century, over 500 Maroons from Jamaica migrated to Nova Scotia, and as they were pushed out of Jamaica by the treacherous colonial government after the Second Maroon War. And in the new century that arrived, the 19th century, an additional 3,000 Black refugees of the War of 1812 migrated to Canada from different points of the United States. Remember that in 1793, Governor Simcoe banned the importation of new slaves to Upper Canada? Well, this meant that any foreign slaves who made it to Upper Canada would be free. So Upper Canada was free soil for any enslaved people who were coming from outside of that jurisdiction. So if you were coming from Michigan, from New York, to the Bahamas, from Jamaica, wherever, and you arrived in Upper Canada, you would be free. But if you were already enslaved in Upper Canada, forget it, you're still a slave. Nonetheless, by the time we get to the closure of the War of 1812, African Americans were fleeing from the United States, where slavery was a fact of life, to Upper Canada, because Upper Canada had become free soil. And remember, Upper Canada, I said, is what is now the province of Ontario. By 1828, for example, we know that communities of Black people existed throughout the province in places like Aura and Ancaster. And in 1834, Britain abolished slavery in its colonies, including Canada. including all the Canadian colonies, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, PEI, Upper and Lower Canada. This made Canada a free soil and an attractive place for African American slaves who ran away from bondage, and more and more and more began to arrive, especially after 1834. As a result, a new era of Black history dawned, and we call this the Underground Railroad era, where at least 30,000 African American enslaved people fled slavery in the United States to the Canadian provinces. The majority came to Ontario, where by 1850 they lived in every township in that province and enlarged and enlivened that province with their skills and talents. We prefer to call these people freedom seekers. Personalities like Henry and Mary Bibb were part of this freedom seekers community. Henry and Mary Bibb founded the Black press in Canada with their newspaper, The Voice of the Fugitive, and that was in Windsor, Ontario. We also have a fur trader by the name of George Bonga, who was involved in fur trading expeditions in the Northwest, in the Midwest, in Minnesota, and so on, from Quebec and from Ontario. In fact, George Bonga was educated in Montreal and became a very well-known fur trader. And also in Ontario, we have Robert Sutherland, the first trained Black lawyer in Ontario. He trained at Queen's University in the 1850s. He was from Jamaica. He was also a very acclaimed scholar at Queen's University. So you have Robert Sutherland becoming part of this freedom seekers community. On the West Coast, in the province of British Columbia, in Victoria, in 1858, 600 Black people arrived on the invitation of Governor Douglas, who wanted subjects loyal to Britain. These newly arrived Blacks came up from San Francisco. They eventually homesteaded and lived in various parts of the colony, including Victoria, Vancouver, Kamloops, New Westminster, Salt Spring Island, and other places. Some important names in this community include Mifflin Gibbs, Emma Stark, and Josephine and Philip Sullivan. Now, in 1867, the Canadian colonies formed themselves into a confederation, the Confederation of Canada. In terms of immigration, the newly confederated country conceptualized itself as a white man's country and had a preference for white immigrants, whether these came from US, the United States, Britain, or different points in Europe. And when I say a white man's country, our leaders, the first Prime Minister of Confederation, Sir John A. Macdonald, that's how they thought of Canada. It was to be a space for the white sons and daughters of Canada and of Europe and elsewhere. They wanted white immigrants. By the time the 20th century dawned, the national government of Canada was putting plans in place to prevent people of color from immigrating to the country, except in special circumstances. In 1911, the federal government under Prime Minister Laurier passed an order in council banning the migration of Black people to Canada. Yes, you heard that right. Banning the migration of Black people to Canada. However, before 1911, when this order in council was passed, about 1,500 Black persons from the American Midwest and southern states had already migrated to the prairie provinces. And in the prairie provinces, they settled in Alberta, Calgary, Athabasca, Maidstone, Campsie, Amber Valley, and other sites. However, the order in council and other anti-Black immigration measures slowed and then dried up Black immigration to Canada. So what happened is that 1911, 1921, 1931, when you look at the federal census, there's actually a decrease in the number of Black people in Canada because very few were coming in as immigrants, and many who were already in the country migrated to the United States where they had better opportunities. The discriminatory immigration practices were not lifted until 1962, when Prime Minister Diefenbaker introduced the points system. In the 20th century, especially after World War I and World War II, the domestic scheme was initiated. Remember, I said that Black migration to Canada was banned, except under special circumstances. And the domestic scheme was one such circumstance. So white Canadian families wanted maids and housekeepers, and they initiated a very limited program to bring domestics from the Caribbean to work in the homes of white families. After World War I, there was such a scheme that brought women from Guadeloupe to the province of Quebec. And after World War II, there was another scheme, Caribbean domestic scheme, was initiated that brought women from the English-speaking colonies and from South America, Guyana in South America, to Canada to work in these homes. So special programs. Later on, male farm workers and students were allowed in from the Caribbean. The point system was expanded in 1967 to allow more Blacks and other people of color to immigrate to Canada. So the point system basically gives you points on certain skills that you may have. So if you spoke English or French, you'd get points for that. If you're educated to high school, if you graduated from high school, you get points for that. If you have a university degree or a professional degree, you'd get points for that. And when these points add up, they say, okay, this person is an ideal person to migrate to Canada. So because of the point system, many thousands of people after 1967 were allowed in from the Caribbean, especially because they were educated, they spoke one of the official languages, and so on. In 1971, with the introduction of official multiculturalism, tens of thousands of Black people from the English and French Caribbean migrated to Canada. Black people also came from South America and other parts of Central America. In the 1970s and 80s, immigration from the continent of Africa intensified. And today, the largest cohorts of Black people migrating to Canada are from the African continent. All these diverse groups and streams of people from numerous points of the Black diaspora have come together to create a new community of Black Canadians. So from the time of Olivier Jeune in 1629 to present time, you have these diverse groups that have entered Canada, have intermingled, interacted from coast to coast to coast, and have created a vibrant Black culture and a long-lasting history. Over the course of 4 centuries, Black people have endured slavery, racist abuse, segregation, and the color bar. The theme of oppression is braided throughout our history. Yet, in this history, oppression is twinned with resistance. The various civil and human rights movement in Canada, from the earliest days of slavery to the immigration struggles, is a testament to Black resistance and resilience. It is this multi-layered history that this project examines. Thank you very much.